Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our third weekly Testnet AMA walkthrough update. We're hosting these every week on Friday at 11:15 Pacific time so that we can keep you guys up to date, allow you guys to answer any questions about this week's challenges or updates. And obviously this week we have sent out quite a few updates and have fielded a lot of questions from the community. So we are excited to dive in. So the format of this one is going to follow the same sort of format that we have before. We're going to hand over the floor to Will for a couple of updates. Then for 30 minutes, I've got some pre-selected questions from our testnet discussion channels, our AMA channels, just kind of all across the Discord on some of the most common questions that were being asked this week. And then at the 15 minutes at the end of the session, I'm also going to open up the floor for live questions in the chat. So if you have any questions while we're talking, please drop them in the chat. I will be monitoring during the whole session. Now, before I hand it off to Will, I also wanted to flag that attending an AMA is going to be one of next week's quest challenges. And for that, you're going to need to plug in a secret code for next week's quests. That secret code is Testnet AMA 210. I will put that in the chat feed. I will put that also on the YouTube video once we upload this to our channel, as well as plugging that code at the end. But if you're participating in our Crew 3 quest system and want to write that down, you're going to have to input that code next week for some sweet XP. So, remember to do that. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over the mic to Will, and he's going to provide you a bunch of updates that we have from the engineering side of things on where we're at with Testnet, what to expect next week, and a bunch of other stuff. So thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Casey, and hello. Just to get started with a little update on where we're at with Testnet. As many of you have seen, we did have a couple bumps in the road this week. We had a few nodes that were not syncing with the network. In fact, all nodes who were trying to join the network ended up with an error code and couldn't sync with the network. We had some cross-chain transactions that were slow and intermittent in the wallet. And then I think we had a lot of UTXO errors in the wallet as well. I think the majority of these have been addressed at this stage. We found out that the problems with the chain syncing were largely due to just a really small error in the configuration file for nodes. So with the new configuration file, nodes should be able to sync correctly. Problems with the faucet and cross-chain transactions, I think, were largely due to our Bootstrap nodes being on fairly low-powered cloud instances. They were on really small, I think like 2-core instances. So we beefed those up, and that should speed things up quite a bit and hopefully address a lot of the issues you guys were having in the wallet. I think there's still some remaining issues with UTXO kind of getting out of sync within the wallet or timing out. We're going to look into those this week, and hopefully we'll have some pushes, some fixes to push next week, along with some of the outstanding bugs that we're tracking down still with staking duration, balance, and external links. I don't have this all on a slide this week. It's been a busy week, obviously, with the testnet problems. So all that being said, the network should be running just fine for now, but next week we are going to be resetting it anyway, and that's to do a few things. Number one, there are some vulnerabilities that we want to patch that are, they're vulnerabilities we're well aware of and come from our Fork Avalanche. So we're going to go ahead and get those patched. And then we're getting ready for next week's big launch, which is going to be around EVM on the C chain. So that'll basically look like we'll have EVM support docs. We're going to have our first internal explorer. Fingers crossed, it is working in a prototype stage at the moment. We're testing it internally. So hopefully we'll have a C-Chain Explorer out next week. And then we're also going to be kind of revising the node strategy. When I put out that request for node participation, I was kind of expecting about 100 people to show up and volunteer. And before I turned off the application form, we had hit almost 1,200 applicants. And our team is just a little too small still to support that to really support a node community that large this early. So we're going to take a little bit of a revised approach. We're going to do it a bit more metered. So when we reset the network next week, we're probably going to have at least a day or two with no external nodes, just our Bootstrap nodes and internal team nodes. And then we're going to onboard a small cohort of kind of handpicked node operators. We'll pick a couple people from the community who have been really active and kind of know what they're doing already. And then we're going to be handpicking a couple other node operators that are kind of more professional. And we're doing that for a few reasons. Number one, we can use this first cohort to really streamline and update like our node onboarding documentation. So we'll catch any errors or any common problems that people will run into when they're setting up these nodes. And then because a lot of the node operators we're going to have in this first cohort are pretty experienced, we'll be able to get a lot of information from them in terms of tracking down bugs and stress testing the network, because stress testing the network is probably going to be the next big, hopefully community-driven activity following the EVM release. So if you have applied to run a node, you are still on the list. Once we open up to the community again, we'll get back to you with a schedule for which cohort you'll be onboarding on. But we do appreciate all of you guys, offering to operate validators in the network, and hopefully we can get you in there soon. But right now, timeline wise, it's looking like it's probably going to be at least a month before we do any type of large scale onboarding of external validators. We will do a little bit in the short term, but yeah. So if you're running a node and it's not a validator, you're welcome to continue running it. But it's not going to be participating in consensus. It's going to be kind of the only reason you might want to do so is if you're actually actively using the node to develop on or to verify your transactions. So if you're not validating, I wouldn't necessarily, or developing on the node, I wouldn't waste your CPU or network resources running nodes at this time. There will be further opportunity in the future. So I think that's most of what I wanted to cover for today in terms of a network update. Like I said, the next big things coming out are going to be EVM support, an Explorer, and we'll hopefully have some wallet fixes coming in as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. So I will dive in next to sort of some of the questions that I've gathered from the community across this week. Thanks so much to everyone for submitting, kind of sharing on the AMA channel, also pulled a couple from some other channels as well. But one of our most popular questions, and I'm going to take the nomenclature from our user Nelly, is asking, Testnet is resetting next week. Does that mean our progress will be back to zero?
No, absolutely not. A lot of the progress you guys have been making, I think, is completely off chain. So resetting the network should not affect your progress in the program.
Fantastic. CoKOC asks, and this is like a very sort of top line question, but sort of asking, like, what's the difference between Testnet and Betanet? And sort of some similar questions. I think we've had a little bit of confusion where people are asking, are these tokens real right now? If not, what's the incentive for getting involved? And also just, when's the ideal time for people to get to join? I think we've got a lot of like new users who aren't super familiar with what Testnet is and what these tokens mean. So I'd love if you could kind of dive in a little bit into that just for some of our our beginners and early adopters?
Yeah, so testnet can be thought of kind of like a live prototype. I'd say the big difference between testnet and betanet is an expectation of stability. Testnet, we're actively developing. There's going to be major features and functionality that we're going to be rolling out during testnet. And a lot of kind of the major functionalities that we outline in our white paper are not going to be available until betanet. So in terms of like the core differences between a testnet and a betanet, it's number one, when you get to betanet, there's some expectation of stability. We probably won't be resetting the betanet. So once betanet launches, it will likely continue to run until we roll over to mainnet. And then there's some core functionality from the white paper that we expect to be present when we hit betanet. As far as whether or not it's like whether the tokens are real, they're definitely not real at this stage. But I'll say testnet and betanet are not directly incentivized at this time. They may be in the future, no promises there. But if and when we do incentivize betanet, it'll likely tie in some of the economics of the system and the tokens that you have. We don't have concrete public plans for that at the moment, but it is something we've considered. So like, what's the incentive for actually participating right now? A lot of it's to really help us develop the network, be a part of a community that's really trying to grow out the open metaverse, and kind of like getting to know the team and just being a part of building this. Eventually in the future, yeah, there may be some kind of more explicit incentives, but we're not ready to expose those at the moment.
Thanks, Will. Also got a question from user Smack2 who asks, where are the quests for Lamina1 with the node? Were they taken down? And I can kind of answer this because I'm the one kind of managing our quests and nodes. So yes, we did take down the run a node on Lamina1 quest this week. Basically for all of the reasons Will explained. But yeah, basically that was taken down. If you were a member of our cohort of the over 1,000 people who requested 2,000 Lamina1 tokens, you should have received an email in your inbox, actually 2 emails in your inbox this week with a code that you can input for that XP. We wanted to make sure that, you know, we were playing fair and that everyone who did attempt to set up a node or was trying to could at least get rewarded for that. And if you haven't received the email for some reason, we've been tracking open rates, so it seems like most of the emails did get through. But if they did not, just hit us up, either the moderators or myself, and we can DM you a code. Next question. So KOKOC asks, I received 2,000 tokens, but I haven't tied it to my node ID yet. Due to the fact that the network has quote unquote fallen, I'm afraid to do it. What do you recommend?
Yeah, so as we just described, we are going to reset the network, so those tokens will be reset as well, and we won't be. I would say hold off at least until next week and see if you're part of that initial cohort of validators. If you are part of the initial cohort of validators, we're going to reach out to you individually. And we'll give you some direct instructions on how to get set up, and we'll get you your tokens. So I would say just wait until next week.
Min Toan Bui asks, can I run a node without the 2,000 tokens? I know I can't become a validator, but I mean, is this good for the project?
Yeah, so that's what I was trying to describe earlier. Anyone's welcome to run a node, but yeah, until it's a validator, it's not actively participating in the network. So is it good for the project? It doesn't do too much to help the project unless you're actively developing on it or pinging it like with its API to get information about your transactions. Until it's a validator, it's just not actively doing anything in the network. So if it's running on like your personal network or you're paying money to run it, I would suggest, unless you're actively developing on it, to shut it down until you become a validator. But because no, it's not actively doing anything in the network.
Awesome. I'm going to skip forward. A bunch of these questions are kind of similar, Will. But
Sure.
one of the questions that Jackal Girl is asking us is kind of more towards the future, but she asks, how do you plan to deploy the L1 token when we've reached the mainnet side of things? How will coins be minted? What will the transition from testnet to mainnet look like? And what do you plan to do to ensure that L1 token generation and distribution gels with the company's vision and doesn't get overrun by crypto bros trying to pre-buy and then pump and dump?
I think you'll be pleasantly surprised with our approach to this. It's not something we're ready to talk about yet. We'll probably release some type of economics paper that describes the allocation of coins and where they're all coming from and where they're going to. But until that becomes public, I don't think we're ready to talk about it at this stage. But I will say, I'm with you. One of the reasons I came to this project was to try to avoid kind of what you see in this space, which is pre-selling a lot of tokens to crypto investors and seeing them get dumped on the market. It's not something I believe in, and from what I've heard, it's definitely not an approach we're going to be taking. So stay tuned. We'll get you some more information on this. But as far as the transition from testnet to mainnet, it does look like it's going to be at least probably another quarter in testnet. So we'll probably be here for another couple months. We're likely to hit a Betanet maybe next quarter. And then we definitely want to be in mainnet before the end of the year, hopefully well before the end of the year.
Awesome. Musashi13 asks, do we have any kind of timeline on when we open up for new node operators again? I know you addressed a little bit of this, that it'll be happening in stages, but for someone who's like a person who requested 2,000 tokens and is now sitting in that forum, how long could they expect to have to wait?
Yeah, so if you're in the initial cohort, it'll be probably about a week. And then we'll probably onboard another group in about 2 to 3 weeks. I think we'll likely want to keep it under 50, at least for the rest of this month. And then maybe next month we might look at opening up a little wider. And that's just so that we can manage support and, handle any issues as they pop up with a more reasonable node community size. So I would say if you're not part of the initial node cohort, it's not going to be until next month at the earliest.
Awesome. So Inutik asks again, and we get this question quite a lot, but these questions are sort of ramping up now that we've had a couple of kind of resets and announcements on the platform. But people are asking, why did you choose to fork Avalanche and not something like Cosmos SDK, for example? And then a much larger question that we can maybe address a little bit later, but can the open metaverse live without blockchain, or is it mandatory?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay, so we'll start with why we forked Avalanche. There are quite a few projects out there, layer one projects out there that I'm a personal fan of. So we looked at Cosmos, we looked at ICP, we looked at Polkadot, we looked at Aptos and Sui, and obviously at Avalanche. We chose Avalanche for a few reasons. Number one, we wanted something with a pretty mature Ethereum virtual machine, EVM. And that was because a lot of the creators out there who have launched projects in the blockchain Web3 space have launched them on EVMs. So we didn't want to take on the burden of trying to onboard like a whole new class or cohort of developers on something like Move or like on Solana's smart contract platform. So EVM, a mature EVM framework was really important to us, and that really limited it down. Polkadot probably would have been my favorite if they had a native EVM framework that was mature enough and adopted. They do have some parachains that are coming out pretty soon, or that have been coming out for the past year or two, that are getting some traction. But again, we wanted something that was well tested right out the gate. And Avalanche's EVM, I believe, is based off Geth, which has been around for years now. So that was one reason. The other was pure scalability and throughput. Cosmos is still running on a fairly old proof of stake consensus algorithm. It's a pretty strong one based off PBFT, which is really great, but it doesn't really support a lot of throughput. And Avalanche's kind of DAG based consensus was really good at kind of like supporting those high throughput numbers we were looking at, especially for stuff like microtransactions. Another thing is Avalanche has a built-in framework for scaling through sharding. So they have their subnet architecture, which we'll be releasing one of these weeks, probably near the end of the month, maybe early next month. And that allows anyone to build their own L2 on top of our platform. So they'll get their own dedicated blockchain and their own dedicated resources. So that's interesting in and of itself, but what's maybe more interesting and more how we're going to leverage it is we really want to provide like a suite of metaverse services. Most of those we've outlined in our white paper. And those metaverse services we see living on these L2 blockchains built on top of L1. So we would have dedicated subnets for, say, storage and identity solutions and streamlined DVMs. So that's one reason why we decided to, those are kind of like the primary reasons we decided to go with Avalanche. It's technically one of the more advanced platforms out there. It's got a really mature EVM, and it's got really good scaling functionality. Can the open metaverse live without blockchain, or is it mandatory? This is a really tough question to answer. I'm sure there are ways that a metaverse could live without, an open metaverse could survive without blockchain. I think blockchain is a really valid approach to enabling an open metaverse because it comes with kind of a user governed infrastructure, which I think is going to be really important moving forward. The whole reason we kind of went down or why Neil kind of started this project was, when he was looking at building the metaverse, he didn't want it to be a walled garden like, Meta or any of these other metaverse projects that are run by centralized privately owned companies. He wanted it to be something that was kind of like for the creators, by the creators. And that's one thing that blockchain has always been very good at, is incentivizing like a community of creators to come together and develop something. So that's why we chose blockchain. I'm sure there were, maybe some other ways that this could have gone about, maybe using some nonprofits or some other interesting kind of frameworks. But I think blockchain was a good direction.
Yeah, I could just jump in here really quick. Will, this is Mahoney. Hi, everybody. From the tooling team. I think another good question, out for the community to ask is, do you necessarily have to jump through the hoops that have existed for blockchain, or learn Web3 as a whole, as a classic game developer or a web developer? And I think the answer there, at least in my mind, is that what we'd like to do is bridge the gap for developers from those communities into onboarding onto blockchain and Web3 technology in as much of a way as you'd like to dig into it. All the way from just a Web2 developer to a node validator. So if that makes sense, Will, that's at least how I feel on the tooling side.
Yeah, definitely.
So I got a more tactical question in the chat just now from Cappy, and he's asking to dive a little bit deeper into cohort selection. So he asks, or they ask, are you choosing members for each cohort based on answers in the form? What's the criteria for choosing, who gets to go first, who's in what cohort, etc.?
Yeah, good question. So there's a couple things we're going to look at. Number one, like how early they applied. So we'll want, people who were kind of closer at the beginning of the line to come on board first. We're going to be looking at where they're operating their nodes. We probably want a pretty good spread between people running on, say, dedicated servers and cloud instances. For the first cohort, because we're going to be doing a lot of benchmarking. So it'll give us kind of like a standard that we can rely on. So when we onboard a lot of nodes that are running on, say, personal computers, which hopefully we'll do very soon, it introduces a lot of heterogeneous like network characteristics to the equation. So some people are running on like 10 megabit per second up and down, and they're sharing it with their personal computer, and their roommate watching Netflix in the next room, which is great for decentralization, but makes it really hard for us to like pull in real metrics about where the consensus protocol itself starts bottlenecking at a theoretical level. So we'll be looking at that. We'll also be looking at kind of people who have been very involved in the community. So we've been helping other people get on board. And we're doing that primarily because we think those people will be great for helping develop the onboarding documentation for other node operators. And then we're looking for a geographic distribution. So we want to get nodes in a couple different geographic locations. We don't want them all to be like, say, in the United States, because again, that doesn't give us like really good metrics as to how the network's going to perform, because eventually this should be something that's widely decentralized. So I'd say those are the primary metrics, at least for the community driven, or the nodes that are going to be selected from the community. From the professional node operators, we'll be looking at a few things like, which platforms have they run nodes on? Are they going to have people that are going to be very responsive to questions and helping us debug and providing logs when we need them? And kind of like what type of economic structures do they look at seeing in mainnet? So we'll be considering kind of a wide range of different parameters when we choose the initial cohort. But we're hoping that it'll be a pretty fair selection process.
I've got one from Jackal Girl that is super interesting that she plugged in at 9 o'clock this morning. And she writes, I recently received a notification from Kraken that due to a settlement with the US SEC, they won't be providing staking services to US customers, kind of speaking of the importance of decentralization. So she asked, does Lamina1 have any sense whether decisions like this and the SEC's forays into blockchain regulation is going to impact the Lamina1 system since it's based on proof of stake? Do you envision any limitations, such as US validators not being able to receive a reward for validating, or otherwise have any sense of how this might impact the Lamina1 ecosystem and its development down the road?
Super good question. Standard disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, but this is definitely, this is part of why we want to ensure that the network is as fully decentralized as possible, both in testnet and betanet, but especially in mainnet. I would say we don't fall into the same category as Kraken with regards to this particular regulatory concern, because this is mostly targeted towards anyone that's doing custodial staking. So that means, like exchanges, this is what we talked about, I think in the last call when we talked about wallets. There's different types of wallets. A custodial wallet is when someone else is holding the keys to your wallet. So they basically control your coins for you. And that's kind of what Kraken was doing and what a lot of exchanges do. So when you store your coins on an exchange, they're held custodially. And that means that the exchange itself is responsible for those coins and everything that's done with them. So obviously, if the exchange is in the US and all of those coins are being held in the US and being controlled by a US entity, then that introduces a lot of regulatory concern, both for the organization and for the coins being held. So it's something where, we follow, I've been following for years, both here and at XX, my previous project, and it is driving some of our considerations, as we just talked about, both in terms of like where we're going to have our nodes early on in the network. And then obviously, we aren't a custodial solution, but we'll want to make sure that, our coins are widely distributed eventually during mainnet.
Thanks, Will. We have run out of questions, so I think we might be able to jump out of this one a little bit earlier. This is kind of a shorter AMA than we've had in the past, but yeah, thank you all so much for joining us. In general, I mean, we'll keep you guys updated on the testnet reset next week. Obviously, we've got some really exciting things coming down the pipeline with regards to EVM and Explorer. And just wanted to flag again that the secret code to redeem your XP for next week quest is testnet AMA 210. It's in the chat. I'm going to attach it to the YouTube video that we upload on Monday that kind of shares this out for the rest of the community. But thank you all so much for joining us again this week. We'll see you next week. As always, just feel free to keep the conversations going in testnet discussion. We'll be sharing updates in testnet updates. Share any questions you have and AMA questions. We'll make sure that we get to them in future sessions. And again, thank you all so much for sticking with us. We're excited to keep building together.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, take care. Happy Friday, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Cheers.